Evelyn ran. The jungle blurred around her as she stumbled through the undergrowth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The crown was in her hands, its emeralds cold and heavy. The moment she had lifted it from the pedestal, the temple had come alive with noise, groaning stone, shifting walls, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Rico was ahead of her, his machete flashing in the faint light. He slashed at vines and low-hanging branches, clearing a path as they fled from the sanctuary. Behind them, the sound of something massive stirred. The temple seemed to collapse upon itself, stone grinding against stone. But the noise wasn't just structural. There was something alive within it, something that roared in a language no human could understand. "Keep moving," Rico shouted over his shoulder. His voice was hoarse, raw from yelling. Evelyn didn't need to be told twice. Her legs burned with exertion, her heart pounding in her ears. The crown seemed heavier than it had been before, as if it carried the weight of the entire jungle. She couldn't let it go, not now. Not after everything. They burst into a clearing, the sudden brightness making Evelyn squint. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with deep reds and purples. Shadows crept across the ground, stretching long and ominous. Rico stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "What did you do?" he demanded. His machete hung at his side, forgotten. "What have you brought upon us?" Evelyn couldn't speak. She clutched the crown tightly, her knuckles white. Her mind raced back to Harding's warnings, the cryptic notes scrawled in the margins of his journal. "Do not disturb the sanctity of the crown. Its curse will follow." She had ignored them, convinced she could handle whatever came next. She had been wrong. "Rico," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." A deep, guttural growl interrupted her. The sound came from the jungle, low and rumbling, like distant thunder. Rico's eyes darted toward the trees. He raised his machete again, his hands trembling. "It's not over," he said. "We have to keep moving." Evelyn nodded, forcing herself to breathe. The growling grew louder, closer, and then there was another sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling violently. Something was coming. Rico took a step back, his gaze fixed on the shadows. "Run," he said quietly. Then louder, "Run." Evelyn turned and sprinted. Her body screamed in protest, her muscles aching from the endless exertion, but adrenaline pushed her forward. The crown felt like a lead weight in her hands, but she couldn't drop it. The jungle closed in around her, the clearing fading behind her as the underbrush thickened. She didn't dare look back. The growling and snapping were all the encouragement she needed to keep moving. Rico's footsteps were close behind, then beside her, then ahead. He moved with a speed and grace she couldn't match, carving a path through the dense foliage. She followed, trusting him to lead her out of this nightmare. Time lost meaning as they ran. The jungle became a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes, the sounds of pursuit ever present. Evelyn's lungs burned, her legs threatened to give out, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not until she was sure they were safe. Finally, they stumbled into another clearing, smaller and darker than the last. Rico collapsed against a tree, his chest heaving. Evelyn fell to her knees, clutching the crown to her chest as she tried to catch her breath. The jungle was quieter here, the growling and snapping distant. But it wasn't gone. The danger still lurked just beyond the trees. "We need a plan," Rico said between gasps. "We can't keep running forever." Evelyn nodded weakly, her mind racing. They had to do something. They had to stop whatever was chasing them. She looked down at the crown, its emeralds gleaming faintly in the dim light. Harding had called it a beacon, a source of power that could draw the attention of ancient forces. She hadn't believed him. Not until now. "What if," she began, her voice trembling. "What if we give it back?" Rico glared at her. "You think it's that simple? You think we can just walk back to that temple and put it back on the pedestal?" "I don't know." Evelyn snapped. She closed her eyes, trying to think. I don't know what else to do." Rico shook his head. "It's too late for that. The temple's gone. It collapsed as soon as we left. There's no going back. Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. If they couldn't return the crown, what could they do? She thought of the carvings in the temple, the warnings etched into the stone. She remembered Harding's journal, the cryptic symbols he had tried to decipher. There had to be another way. Before she could say anything, the growling returned. This time, it was louder, closer, and accompanied by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Rico sprang to his feet, machete in hand. Evelyn clutched the crown tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. The jungle came alive with movement. Shadows shifted, branches shook, and then they saw it. A massive, hulking figure emerging from the darkness. Its form was indistinct, shrouded in a swirling mist that seemed to cling to its body. Eyes like glowing embers burned through the haze, fixed on Evelyn and the crown she held. Rico took a step forward, placing himself between Evelyn and the creature. "Stay behind me," he said. Evelyn didn't argue. She scrambled to her feet, gripping the crown as if it could protect her. The creature moved slowly, its movements deliberate. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It simply advanced, its presence overwhelming. Rico raised his machete. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Why are you here?" The creature stopped, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound that resonated in their minds. A deep, rhythmic pulse that formed thoughts without language. "Return what you have taken." Evelyn gasped. She looked at the crown, then at Rico. "It wants the crown," she said, her voice barely audible. Rico's grip on his machete tightened. "If we give it the crown, what happens to us?" The creature's pulse grew louder, more insistent. "The crown is not yours. It belongs to the sanctuary. It belongs to the balance." Evelyn hesitated. She had spent years searching for this artifact, risking everything to find it. But now, standing before this ancient, otherworldly presence, she felt the weight of her actions. The crown wasn't just a relic. It was a keystone in a delicate balance she didn't understand. Rico turned to her, his expression hard. "Evelyn, this thing is not going to stop. If you don't give it the crown, we're dead." Evelyn looked at the crown again. It felt so heavy in her hands, heavier than it should. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward. The creature's glowing eyes followed her every movement. "What'll happen if I give it back?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Will you leave us alone?" The creature didn't answer, but the pulsing resonance in her mind softened, becoming more like a steady rhythm. She took that as a yes. Slowly, carefully, Evelyn placed the crown on the ground. The emerald seemed to dim slightly, as if acknowledging the act. She stepped back, her hands trembling. The creature approached, its massive form looming over the crown. It paused, then extended a hand, or something like a hand. The mist around it swirled, and the crown rose from the ground, hovering in the air. The emeralds pulsed once, twice, then faded completely. For a moment, there was silence. The creature stood motionless, the crown floating before it. Then, without a sound, it began to dissolve. The mist dissipated, the glowing eyes faded, and the crown disappeared with it. Evelyn and Rico stood frozen, the jungle around them eerily still. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. "Is it over?" Evelyn whispered. Rico lowered his machete slowly, his eyes scanning the jungle. "I think so." They didn't move for a long time, waiting to see if the creature would return. But the jungle remained quiet. Whatever force had been unleashed was gone. Evelyn sank to her knees, her body shaking. She had come so far, sacrificed so much, only to realize that the crown wasn't something she could keep. It wasn't a treasure.